Hey everyone, this is Chapter 7 of Death and Disorder, a History of Early Modern England from 1485 to 1690. It's by Ken Macmillan. The chapter is titled Restoration and Revolution, 1660 to 1690. First section, Death and Disorder, the Bloody Assizes. As we have seen in earlier chapters, early modern England took disorderly events such as rebellions very seriously, and the effort to restore order was often very violent. Soon after becoming king in 1685, James II faced a rebellion led by his nephew, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, who was his brother Charles II's eldest illegitimate son. Monmouth landed in Dorset in the West Country on June 11, 1685, and gathered a rebel force of artisans and farmers to fight for his claim to the throne. The well-trained royalist army proved far too strong an opponent, and the Monmouth rebellion was decisively ended at the Battle of Sedgemoor on July 6th. More than 1,300 were killed in battle, and another 1,300 or so were taken into custody. Monmouth was executed for treason 9 days later. The deaths had just begun. A series of trials or assizes began in August to try the rebels who had been captured during the rebellion and awaited punishment. This in itself was a bit unusual. Although it was common for the leaders and organizers of rebellions to be executed, the rank and file were usually indemnified or pardoned and allowed to live as a sign of the monarch's mercy. In this case, however, James dispatched the Lord Chief Justice of England, quote, hanging judge, end quote, George Jeffreys, to the West Country to deal with the prisoners. Together with 4 other judges, Jeffreys traveled to Winchester, Salisbury, Dorchester, Taunton, and Wells, presiding over more than 1,000 treason trials in just 1 month. The first casualty of these assizes was Alice Lisle, an elderly woman who had harbored fugitives after the defeat at Sedgemoor. Many, including members of the jury that convicted her of treason, had expected the sentence to be remitted by the king, but they were disappointed. Initially sentenced to being burned at the stake, the sentence was commuted to beheading, which was carried out in Winchester on September 2nd. By the end of September, nearly 300 other rebels were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. In Taunton Assize, 500 prisoners were tried in 2 days, 140 hanged in the aftermath. Their remains were displayed on pikes through the West Country as warnings to those who still considered rebellion against their king. Another 800 men and women were sentenced to be transported into the English colonies in the Caribbean. Although this might appear merciful, many considered transportation worse than death. They lived as indentured servants, enduring extremely harsh conditions, never seeing England again, and more often than not dying before the term of indenture was over. Still others remained imprisoned awaiting trial, where they succumbed to jail fever, typhus, because of the poor diet and sanitary conditions of early modern English prisons. For good reason, these trials in the West Country have come to be known as the, quote, bloody assizes, end quote. Even at a time when public executions for various felony offenses were relatively common, this number of deaths at the hands of the state in such a short space of time was extraordinary. When Jeffreys returned to London, the king, far from rebuking the judge for his severity, promoted him to Lord Chancellor and made him a baron. This act surely did little to engender love or loyalty for the Catholic monarch. When James II was forced to abandon his throne in 1688, Jeffreys was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he died in 1689. Numerous pamphlets were published after his death, including a New Martyrology, or The Bloody Assizes, 1693, which styled itself a sequel to Fox's Book of Martyrs. The author ended the book with an elegy, quote, He, Jeffreys, with commission rid the Jeffreys, with commission rid the land about, but still he aimed to keep fair justice out. With angry look he browbeat rightful cause, and his bold hand did sacrifice the laws. Tore 'em or trampled on 'em with his paws, inquisitor like Spain in England sate, and at their pleasure steered the helm of fate. He rid the western circuit all around, but where he came no justice to be found. He improved his talents, martyrs to condemn. Hang, draw, and quarter was his daily theme. He bid 'em to confess, if ever they hope, to be reprieved from the fatal rope. This seemed a favor, but he'd none forgive. The favor was a day or two to live, which those had not that troubled him with trial, his business blood, and would have no denial. End quote. Thomas Pitt, A New Martyrology, or The Bloody Assizes. Another author wrote satirically that Jeffreys, quote, had such respect to the souls of men that he scarce hanged any but those that were innocent, end quote. Historians often cite the, quote, bloody assizes, end quote, as the cause of defense lawyers entering the criminal courtroom. The Treason Act of 1696 granted those accused of high treason access to counsel, the right to compel witness attendance, and a copy of the charges against them, all of which defendants had previously been denied. Although the, quote, bloody assizes, end quote, were perhaps the most severe judicial killings in English history, they helped to bring about modernity in the criminal justice system that over the next century saw a dramatic decrease in the number of executions in England. Like most of the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, Charles II was bright, well-educated, and multilingual. Excuse me, the new section. Where am I? Okay, sorry, I skipped something. Discussion 7.1. Why do you think James II promoted Jeffreys to the position of Lord Chancellor despite likely knowing this would be an unpopular decision, given Jeffreys' actions during the bloody assizes? The Merry Monarch. Like most of the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, Charles II was bright, well-educated, and multilingual. He was also the most popular Stuart monarch in part because of his affable nature and because he showed himself to be tolerant, tactful, moderate, and compromising, all in contrast to his father. For one example of this is his stance towards the regicides, the radical rump, and the supporters of the Protectorate. In the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, all persons associated with the parliamentary side were pardoned, with the exception of about 100 people, half of whom were punished with property confiscation, imprisonment, and bans from public office. The other half were found guilty of high treason, but many had already died or fled the country. In October 1660, 10 regicides were hanged, drawn, and quartered, and the bodies of Cromwell and Ireton were exhumed and hanged, with their heads placed on spikes at Westminster Hall, where the High Court of Justice had sat. To be sure, these were extreme acts of violence, but the list of exclusions from the act could have been much longer had Charles and the Convention wanted it that way. As a symbol of further reconciliation, other parliamentary supporters were not only pardoned, but given titles and positions within the government. Many royalists, however, were less than impressed with these largesse, 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 with this largesse, considering that the Declaration of Breda had implied that confiscated land would not be restored. These men often received less favor from the king than his father's former enemies. It also did not hurt Charles's reputation that during the Great Fire of London of 1666, he personally led the rescue efforts and was reportedly seen throwing buckets of water on the flames himself. Although hundreds of buildings and a huge portion of the historical city of London were lost, Charles's actions and those of his brother James were credited as having resulted in minimal loss of life. In the aftermath, the king arranged for food supplies to be brought to the city, issued a proclamation that required neighboring cities and towns to receive those who had become homeless, and set up a court to resolve disputes between landlords and tenants. At Charles's encouragement, the, quote, new city, end quote, was rebuilt with improved sanitation and fire safety, including buildings constructed of brick and stone rather than wood. Modern landmarks such as St. Paul's Cathedral and the monuments, still prominent features in London today, were built by famous architects such as Christopher Wren. Perhaps most importantly, the fire seemed to coincide with purging the last major bout of bubonic plague from London, which had killed at least 75,000 people between 1665 and 1666, but which disappeared from the metropolis thereafter. Charles's moderation towards his enemies and care for his subjects made up for some of his more obvious shortcomings, such as his preference for alcohol, dancing, entertainment, and sport rather than politics. The Restoration Court became a center of patronage for artists, musicians, authors, and scientists. Early in his reign, Charles founded the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and the Royal Society of London, still one of the world's foremost learned societies. The theater, which had been heavily suppressed during the Republic and Protectorate, resurged. Charles's time in France resulted in him bringing to England modern fashions such as the three-piece suit and wigs, and culinary delicacies such as champagne. Frequent subjects of gossip were Charles' dalliances with mistresses. Although his wife, the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza, bore him no living heirs, Charles openly consorted with various women who bore him no fewer than 14 children, all of whom were illegitimate and therefore ineligible to inherit the crown. Because it was the responsibility of a father to provide for his children regardless of their legitimacy, Charles did so through titles, including making his eldest son Duke of Monmouth, leader of the 1685 rebellion, lands and offices at great expense to the court and to the resentment of courtiers and counselors who feared, rightly or wrongly, that the king's women and bastard children exerted undue influence over his state decisions. It is small wonder that Charles was referred to as the, quote, merry monarch, end quote. The Cavalier Parliament. Like most English monarchs, Charles was perpetually in need of money, but history had taught him that many of the revenue streams used by the late Tudor and early Stuart monarchs could not be revived. Impositions, monopolies, ship money, and the profits of fiscal feudalism, wardship, purveyance, forced loans, distraint of knighthood, numerous other means had become immensely unpopular. Accordingly, the convention passed the Tenors Abolition Act, which brought an end to feudalism in England. To replace these sources of revenue, Charles was granted tonnage and poundage for life, an excise tax on alcohol and other beverages, and later a, quote, hearth tax, end quote, which is collected based on the number of chimneys in a home and was, therefore, a graduated tax based on one's wealth. Various parcels of crown land had been confiscated during the war were also returned. Altogether, these sources of revenue were expected to bring in £1,200,000 per year. This was more annual revenue than any previous English monarch had access to, and should, in theory, have been more than enough to fund the court. In practice, the situation was far more complicated. In the first place, the amount of money these sources would bring in could only be estimated rather than guaranteed, which meant that the court was never sure how much money would come into the royal treasury. All it took to reduce expected income was a depressed economy or the onset of continental wars. In addition, Parliament asserted its right to determine the levies described in the Book of Rates, which limited the government's ability to increase the customs duties to make up for income shortages. Parliament had also authorized the collection of a poll tax in order to pay off the new model army so that it could be disbanded. Together with the loss of traditional feudal revenues and the requirement to pay the hearth tax, the poll tax placed a heavy financial burden on the English gentry and citizenry throughout the country, who bore the greatest onus of parliamentary taxation. Furthermore, as discussed, Charles operated a very expensive court, filled with patronage, positions, and pensions, not to mention the extraordinary funding that would be needed during the Great Plague and Great Fire. Finally, collectively, most of these sources of revenue were determined by Parliament, which placed Charles in a highly dependent situation with a body that, in the past, had used the king's paucity as leverage in securing better constitutional terms. This leverage was aided by the claim of Charles's first Parliament, the so-called Cavalier Parliament, which sat intermittently from 1661 to 1679. That statute took precedence over proclamations, a natural evolution of Charles' desire in the Declaration of Breda to work with a, quote, free parliament, end quote. Charles had also in the Declaration, quote, granted, liberty to tender consciences, quote, liberty to tender consciences, end quote, provided they did not, quote, disturb the peace of the kingdom, end quote, and promised to, quote, consent to such an act of Parliament upon mature deliberation for the full granting that indulgence, end quote. This largely left it up to Parliament to determine what nonconformist religion in England should look like, and gave it the ability to legislate in ways not originally intended by the king. Had Charles intended to offer a, quote, indulgence, end quote, to Catholics who had offered him succor during his exile, and to the various puritanical sects that had emerged in the 1640s? Or were these outlier religions disturbing to the peace of the realm? Whatever Charles thought or wanted, Parliament, which was dominated by Anglicans, including the bishops in the restored House of Lords, the Royalists, opted for persecution. The decision resulted between 1661 and 1665 in the passage of the, quote, Clarendon Code, end quote, named after Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, Charles's first Lord Chancellor. In fact, the name was a misnomer, as Clarendon likely had little to do with the passage of the religious code and disagreed with much of it. Regardless, the Clarendon Code involved the passage of numerous pieces of legislation. The Corporation Act of 1661 required town officials to swear an oath that they would accept Anglican communion, thus preventing Presbyterians and Puritans from holding public office. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 ordered clergy and teachers to use the Book of Common Prayer and assent to its doctrine, by which about 1,750 ministers were removed from their parishes. In the same year, another act required Quakers to swear their allegiance to the king, even though their belief did not allow them to accept hierarchy or state authority, and the Licensing Act sought to suppress radical pamphleteering by, for example, fifth monarchists. The Conventicle Act of 1664 made religious meetings of more than 5 nonconformists illegal, and the 5 Mile Act of 1665 forbade clergymen who had been expelled to live close to their former parish, or of living near any town unless they swore allegiance to the king in the prayer book. At this stage, no attempts were made to persecute Catholics, for the simple reason that penal laws already existed and could be applied as needed. In sum, despite Charles's promises for religious liberty, the hegemony of the Church of England was strengthened, while all dissenting faiths were suppressed. Discussion question 7.2. Why do you think Charles II gave royal assent to the Clarendon Code, despite its being at odds with the Declaration of Breda and with Clarendon's own position? War, politics, and religion. By the time the Clarendon Code was passed in its entirety, Charles and Parliament faced pressing foreign affairs issues. The most significant of these was the resumption of war with the Dutch. The cause of the war was the passage in 1660 of the Navigation Act, a revised version of one passed by the Rump in 1651 and the Staple Act of 1663. Together, these acts forbade English colonies, to be discussed in the next chapter, from trading with other countries, including the Netherlands, France, and Spain, required goods to be transported to, quote, British bottoms, end quote, British-owned and crewed ships, in order that certain goods shipped to or from the colonies first passed through an English port. There were good reasons for these measures, such as ensuring that England's store of bullion, gold and silver, remained in the country and that customs duties could be collected from recalcitrant colonial merchants. But it also had the impact of damaging international shipping, which up to this point had been dominated by the Dutch. Anglo-Dutch competition and belligerence in the Americas and Africa eventually led to a declaration of war, supported by a large parliamentary grant to build up the navy. The war initially went well for England. The English managed to take New Netherland, later renamed New York, from the Dutch in America, and Charles's brother James, Duke of York and Lord High Admiral, and cousin, Prince Rupert, claimed several victories over the Dutch fleet. However, by 1666, France had entered the war as an ally to the Dutch, and the devastation of domestic events, plague and fire, encouraged the king to make overtures to peace. In the meantime, Charles began secret negotiations with France, which led the Dutch, who were aware of the king's general intentions, to undertake the battle on the Medway. In June 1667, the Dutch navy made its way into the Thames and upriver Medway in Kent, where the unmanned and unarmed English naval battleships were anchored. The English lost 15 ships and were forced to sign the Treaty of Breda under generally unfavorable terms. The English kept New York but lost several islands in Indonesia that were valuable in the spice trade, and they were forced to revise the Navigation Act to make it friendlier to the Dutch. In the end, the war was disastrously expensive, dramatically increased the national debt, and led to a trade depression that further reduced income to the royal treasury. The loss of the Anglo-Dutch War was blamed primarily on Clarendon, who was dismissed from his office and went into exile following an impeachment hearing. Clarendon's departure gave rise to a ministerial condition known as the, quote, cabal, end quote. The word had a double meaning. By definition, it referred to a secretive faction involved in political intrigue, but it also conveniently functioned as an acronym for the 5 members who belonged to it. C. Baron Clifford. A. The Earl of Arlington. B. The Duke of Buckingham. A. Lord Ashley. L. The Duke of Lauderdale. There was, in fact, little that these 5 men agreed on, and little evidence that their efforts were secretive and collusive, but in this case, perception was more important than reality. Unlike the early Stuarts, who had tended to prefer a single favorite as advisor, especially Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. Charles's use and abuse of these men allowed him, in essence, to carry out his own desires while the cabal fought among themselves in the Privy Council and Parliament. The cabal, which generally shared the opinion that royal power needed to be strengthened, also gave the impression that the king was moving the government back toward an absolutist stance. Among Charles's and the cabal's personal desires by the late 1660s and early 1670s was allowing greater freedom of religious worship both to those being persecuted by the Clarendon Code and to Catholics who still suffered under harsh penal codes. Charles's mother, who died in 1669, was Catholic, as was his Portuguese wife, and he had close ties to the French court of Louis XIV, where he had spent time during his exile. Moreover, his brother and heir, the Duke of York, had secretly converted to Catholicism in 1668 or 1669, and although he continued to attend Anglican services, his religious beliefs were becoming known. There was naturally also the question of Charles's own religious position, especially given the ambiguity of the Declaration of Breda about freedom of worship. A clue to the king's religious outlook may be found in the Treaty of Dover, signed between Charles and Louis in 1670. The public purport of the treaty involved an alliance against the Dutch and in return for a stipend that would help relieve the king of his dependence on Parliament. However, there was also a secret provision known only to the king and certain members of the cabal, by which, in exchange for more money, Charles promised to convert to Catholicism at a convenient time in the future. Coincidentally, in the same year, Parliament passed a second Conventicle Act, which renewed efforts to suppress nonconformity. The cabal was against it and encouraged the king to use his prerogative powers to address the matter. Constitutionally, the king still had the right as fount of all justice to exercise what was known as, quote, suspending and dispensing, end quote, powers, but the practice was extremely controversial because of the frequency with which the early Stuarts had resorted to it, and because the Cavalier Parliament had come to believe that such actions could not be used to overturn parliamentary legislation. Nevertheless, in 1672, Charles issued the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspended penal codes against nonconformists and relaxed those against Catholics. For the first time in more than a decade, Charles was at odds with his Parliament, which had considerable leverage because money was needed to prosecute the Third Anglo-Dutch War. In exchange for its subsidy, Parliament revoked the declaration and responded by issuing the Test Act. The statute required all office holders to accept a declaration against Catholicism and transubstantiation and take Anglican communion at least once a year. The Duke of York refused to take this, quote, test, end quote, and resigned as Lord High Admiral, an act that publicly outed the heir to the throne as a Catholic. Two additional consequences of these events were the collapse of the cabal, which had engineered the alliance with France, and the Treaty of Westminster, that brought an end to war. Parties, plots, and rebellions. The revocation of the Declaration of Indulgence and the passage of the Test Act initiated another wave of anti-Catholic hysteria in England. This hysteria was piqued by James's marriage to Mary of Modena, a fellow Catholic. In 1673. By his late wife, James already had two daughters, Mary and Anne, both of whom had been raised as Anglicans, and it was expected would marry Protestants. As James at the time of his second marriage was already 40 years old, only a few years younger than the king, there was every reason to believe that he might either predecease his brother and never accede to the throne, or reign for a very short time. In either situation, the crown would go to his daughter Mary, and the Catholic threat that seemed to envelope the monarchy would dissipate. But James's new wife was only 15 years old when they married and had every chance to bear him a son, who would be raised Catholic and would, by right of male primogeniture, automatically take precedence over his sisters. This was a situation that Parliament took very seriously. Even the efforts of Charles's new chief minister, Thomas Osborne, Earl of Danby, to cease these concerns by enforcing strict Anglican conformity and rigorously applying the Clarendon Code was not sufficient to allay these fears. Together with a financial crisis associated with recovering from the Anglo-Dutch War, the Catholic threat was felt in Parliament in another way. The division of its members between a, quote, court, end quote, party loyal to Danby and a, quote, country, end quote, party responsive to the Earl of Shaftesbury, a former member of the cabal, Ashley. Generally, the court party supported divine right monarchy and the king's right to use his royal prerogatives within limits, and it stood behind the Church of England and traditional Anglican worship, essentially the type of men who rallied to the royalist cause in 1642. Later, this party was derisively deferred to by their opposition as, quote, Tories, end quote, which referred to Irish cattle thieves, a reference to the inaccurate perception that they favored Catholicism and did not respect men's property. The members of the Country Party were the champions of parliamentary sovereignty and limited constitutional monarchy, and they wanted toleration for non-radical Protestant dissenters, the type of gentlemen who supported the parliamentary cause in 1642. Later, this group was referred to by their opposition as, quote, Whigs, end quote, or Scottish cattle drivers, giving the perception that the Country Party preferred Presbyterianism and were of a lower social class. Neither party had a majority in Parliament, nor was their initial association anything more than a loose understanding of basic principles. But their emergence represented fracturing within the Cavalier Parliament that had, by 1678, been sitting for nearly 2 decades. Excuse me. The crisis between the two parties was precipitated by the revelation of Titus Oates, a defrocked Anglican clergyman, that the Queen's physician, Sir George Wakeman, and several other Catholics planned to employ Jesuits to poison the king, place James on the throne, and restore Catholicism to England. Oates' claims, though entirely fabricated, stood up well under questioning from the Privy Council in Parliament, and were quote, confirmed, end quote, when a magistrate who had interrogated Oates ended up dead, allegedly at the hands of the Papists. The plot played perfectly into fears of Catholic rebellion since the time of Elizabeth, and with growing concerns about pro-Catholic sentiment at the royal court and the king's secret dealings with France. Oates was believed despite the flimsy nature of his evidence. As the rumors grew and fear racked the nation, many trials and arrests followed. Wakeman was tried and acquitted of the charges, but at least a dozen men were executed for their alleged role in the plot, some of whom were very high profile, though largely apolitical Catholics. Oates was eventually charged with sedition and perjury, fined, and sentenced to life imprisonment, although he was ultimately pardoned in 1689 by William and Mary. The Commons also sought to impeach Danby after evidence was offered proving that he had been complicit in secret negotiations with Louis XIV, prompting the king, after nearly 2 decades, to dissolve the Cavalier Parliament to protect his minister. The dissolution of Parliament, however, turned out to be a significant error. Capitalizing on evidence of a Catholic plot and having the strong support of country gentlemen and town merchants, the Whigs came to dominate the new Parliament elected in 1679, and even the appointment of Shaftesbury as Lord President of the Privy Council did nothing to slow the events that followed. Fully aware of Parliament's position regarding the Catholicism of James, Duke of York, the Lord Chancellor offered to set limits on the power of any Catholic successor, but the Whig-dominated Parliament instead introduced the Exclusion Bill. The bill sought to prevent James from taking the throne in favor of his daughter, Mary, who had recently been wed to William of Orange, the Protestant head of state of the Dutch Republic, and no friend of Louis XIV. The ousting of Danby had removed most Tory support from Parliament, so the bill was most certain to pass if it was put to a vote. To prevent this, Charles prorogued and then dissolved Parliament. The new parliaments that met in 1680 and 1681 were little different in composition and continued to press for the execution, again prompting the king to dissolve these assemblies. It was during these parliaments that the abhorrers, the quote abhorrers, end quote, came to be called the quote Tories, end quote, while the quote petitioners, end quote, became the quote Whigs, end quote. To support their respective positions, Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, written in the 1640s, was published in 1680 to promote the Tory cause, and John Locke began work on his 2 treatises on government, to be discussed below, to advocate for the Whigs. After the dissolution of Parliament in 1681, Charles did not call another session during his lifetime, which was to last for another 4 years. Although the Cavalier Parliament had in 1664 passed a new triennial act making marriages of Parliament even every 3 years recommended rather than required, the decision not to call a session in 4 years violated the spirit of the act and caused some in England to foresee the return of absolutism. This is not helped by the effective proscription of Whigs from government after 1681. Those who could be clearly identified as Whigs were removed from the King's Council and magistracy, and leadership of the local militia bands were remodeled to exclude supporters of the country party. For his role in the exclusion crisis, Shaftesbury was accused of treason, but as London was dominated by Whigs, it was hard to find a jury willing to convict him. When the Tories managed to gain control of London in 1682, Shaftesbury fled to the Netherlands to avoid new legal proceedings. Another consequence of Charles' decision to rule without Parliament was his need to make up for the lost parliamentary subsidy. Along with finding some savings in the operation of the court, Charles was forced to strengthen the methods by which ordinary revenue was collected, efforts that reminded some of his father's fiscal policies during the personal rule half a century earlier. The actions taken against the Whigs over the previous 2 years prompted several extremists to concoct the Rye House plot in the spring of 1683. The ill-conceived plan involved assassinating the king and his brother James as they returned to London after a day at the horse races. The races were cancelled and the plans fell through. 2 months later, news of the plot leaked, which resulted in several arrests and the execution of a dozen people by beheading or being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Another dozen men were imprisoned and fined, while 10, including Locke, fled to the Netherlands. Arthur Capel, Capell, Earl of Essex, committed suicide at the Tower of London to avoid the humiliation of public execution. The conspirators of the Rye House plot expected that if they were successful, the crown would have been claimed either by James's daughter and heir, Mary, or by the eldest son of Charles II, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. Although Monmouth was illegitimate and therefore had no claim to the throne, he was touted as a strong candidate by various supporters. After being identified as a conspirator in the Rye House plot, Monmouth placed himself into exile to avoid prosecution. Charles II died in February 1685, but not before, on his deathbed, converting to Catholicism. James II and the return of absolutism. Despite, as discussed in the opening of this chapter, the Monmouth Rebellion and the, quote, bloody assizes, end quote, early in his reign, James II acceded to a relatively stable throne. Over the previous few years, the national and local governments had been purged of Whigs and replaced with Tories who, despite their dislike of Catholicism, nonetheless believed in James's divine right to rule and had supported that position during the Exclusion Crisis. James, of course, was well aware of the various political and religious controversies that had enshrouded not only his brother's reign, but his father's. Therefore, he started his reign with every intention of supporting the constitutional developments that had emerged since 1660 and the supremacy of the Church of England as the national religion with the king at its head. Those who doubted James's intentions and despised his religion would only have to wait. It was hoped a mere few years, until the Protestant Mary and her French and Catholic hating and constitutional monarchy supporting husband, William of Orange, took their rightful place on the English throne. Come on. Sorry. James's early relations with his Tory-dominated loyal Parliament were good. The institution granted him the same generous revenue stream as his brother had received, which, owing to an increase in trade, placed him in a much better financial position than Charles. But that Parliament also quickly came to learn that the king was very much his father's son. James was no puppet of his people, and sought to rule, if not absolutely, at least independently, with his royal prerogatives intact. In November 1685, James announced his plans to keep the army, which had been assembled to deal with Monmouth's rebellion and another uprising led by the Scottish Earl of Argyll, intact. Beyond its expense, maintaining a standing army in peacetime was, with the exception of Protectorate England in the late 1650s, against English tradition because it was seen to curtail fundamental liberties. The proximity of the army to the capital also raised concerns that the king might use the army to enforce his policies in London. Moreover, James indicated that he planned to allow Catholic officers to command regiments, which was in the contravention of the Test Act. After Parliament was prorogued, never to be called again during his reign, James used the same powers to place Catholics into government offices, welcomed a papal nuncio, ambassador, into his court, and employed a Jesuit confessor, whom he had admitted to the Privy Council. After carefully manipulating the judiciary through dismissals, James sought and won a legal decision on his right to use his suspending and dispensing prerogatives to obviate the Test Act. The success of James's legal case empowered him to issue, in April 1687, a declaration of indulgence suspending the Clarendon Code and providing relief for both dissenters and Catholics. A series of questions posed by Lords Lieutenant to commissioners of the peace, justices, mayors, and aldermen led to the purge of hundreds of Anglicans, many of whom were Tories. Similar steps were taken at the universities. Naturally, Catholics were frequently chosen as replacements, but as the number of prominent Catholics had dwindled considerably in England, By this time, this also meant that many of these new official office holders were not necessarily up to the task. Quakers, Baptists, and Presbyterians were also appointed to the dismay of the Anglican Church. James also established an ecclesiastical commission, a body that in essence replaced the Court of High Commissions, that had been abolished by the Long Parliament, under the authority of Lord Chancellor Jeffreys, to oversee the Church of England and persecute individuals within the Church who were deemed too intolerant of nonconformity. This body arrested 7 bishops, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, on charges of seditious libel, and had them imprisoned in the Tower for claiming in a petition that the declaration was an abuse of the king's suspending powers. At trial, the bishops were acquitted, largely because their right to petition the king was guaranteed in the ancient constitution. In sum, in the space of a mere 2 years, James had managed to alienate the one group in England who truly supported his claim to the throne, the Anglican-leaning Tories. In their minds, the king had demonstrated willful disregard for Parliament, abused his prerogative powers of appointment and dismissal of office holders and the judiciary, abused English legislation through the suspending and dispensing powers, weakened the Church of England through the Commission and the manipulation of the episcopacy, resorted to arbitrary imprisonment despite habeas corpus, and placed England into a virtual state of martial law. Still, many people were willing to wait out the king's death, as by 1687 James was almost the same age as Charles II had been at his demise. The situation changed, however, when rumors began circulating that Queen Mary was pregnant. Both Tories and Whigs knew that if the child was a boy, he would eclipse the claims of his half-sisters to the throne and be baptized Catholic, plaguing England with a Catholic monarch for generations to come. In June 1688, Mary made this fear a reality when she gave birth to James Francis Edward. The birth was witnessed by dozens of courtiers, which was unusual but not unheard of at the time. Important events such as the birth of a possible future king needed to be supported by eyewitness testimony to avoid later claims of illegitimacy. Later, the Protestant witnesses all stated that they had turned away from the queen at the time of the birth to respect her privacy. This enabled the king's enemies to claim either that the child was born still or that there was never was a child, but that another baby was smuggled into the queen's bedchamber in a warming pan. To what extent were the problems that James II faced caused by actions of his brother Charles I? The Revolution of 1688. Shortly after the birth, a group of 7 men, led by Danby, comprising both Tory and Whig positions, conspired together and wrote to William of Orange, inviting him to invade England for the purpose of protecting his wife's birthright and the Protestant faith. They wrote that, quote, "The people are so generally dissatisfied with the present conduct of the government in relation to their religion, liberties, and properties, all which have been greatly invaded, that your highness may be assured there are 19 parts of 20 of the people throughout the kingdom who are desirous of a change." End quote. They also claimed that William would have the support of the vast majority of the nobility and gentry, and that the standing army would not present a challenge because there was so much division between the Catholic and Anglican officers and soldiers. In fact, William had already been planning an invasion, so this invitation merely solidified ongoing arrangements. By September, he had assembled his forces, more than 400 ships and 20,000 men, and issued a declaration assuring the English people of his plan to maintain Protestantism, ensure a free parliament, and investigate the legitimacy of the new prince. The fleet departed the Netherlands on November 1st and arrived in England 4 days later, not without irony, on Gunpowder Day. Over the next few weeks, as William's men moved toward London, undertaking minor skirmishes along the way, James attempted to reserve some of his more controversial policies and dropped the writ for a new parliamentary election, but he refused to restore the Test Act. He also refused to accept assistance from France on the grounds that he would lose domestic support. In hindsight, this was certainly a mistake, as James soon discovered that most of his staunchest supporters had already rallied to William's cause, as had his daughter Anne. In the face of nationwide anti-Catholic rioting, James sent his wife and baby across to France and attempted to escape himself throwing the Great Seal of England into the Thames. In face of nationwide anti-Catholic rioting, James sent his wife and baby across to France and attempted to escape himself, throwing the Great Seal of England into the Thames. Although he had disguised himself, James was captured by sailors as he attempted to flee and was returned to London on December 16th. Through royal commissioners, William communicated to James that he needed to leave London, which he did, and William entered the capital on the 18th. Although James was under Dutch guard, he was allowed to escape, and he fled to France on December 23rd, never again to return to England. Whether the Revolution of 1688 was, as historians once commonly referred to it, quote, glorious, end quote, because so little blood was shed, it was certainly a critical moment in English history and is often seen to have inaugurated a new historical era in England. At the end of December, William took over the government provisionally while a convention parliament was arranged. When that body met in late January 1689, it was well represented with both Tories and Whigs, including many who had been in one or more of Charles's exclusion parliaments. Given this composition, it is perhaps not surprising that lengthy debates took place about how to move forward. Everybody agreed that James could not return to England as king, but there was much dispute about what the future should look like. The Whigs simply preferred to name William as monarch, in effect claiming that the power of the crown came from the people of England. The Tories strongly supported the divine right of kings, which meant that James was the only rightful monarch until his death. They suggested that James retain the crown, but that William or William and Mary become regent until James's death, at which point, assuming one accepted the warming pan controversy, Mary was the heir by divine right. Another option, assuming that James's abandonment of England constituted an abdication of his throne, was to place the crown directly on Mary's head with William as her consort. William, however, who had nearly as close a claim to the throne as Mary, they were first cousins, as William was the son of James II's sister, was unwilling to be his wife's, quote, gentleman usher, end quote. In the end, after much deliberation by both houses of Parliament, they agreed that James had abdicated his throne, which was now vacant and needed to be occupied. This led to the first time and only time in English history when two people, William III and Mary II, were joint regnant monarchs. They agreed that if Mary predeceased her husband, which she did in 1694, William would continue to reign for the remainder of his life. He died in 1702, and then the crown would pass to their children. However, should Mary die childless, which she did, her sister Anne would claim her inheritance. However, should Mary die childless, which she did, her sister Anne would claim her inheritance after William's death, thereby maintaining the notion of natural succession by divine right. In fact, Anne would go on to reign from 1702 to 1714. In effect, this resolution was via media between the Whig and Tory positions. Mary ascended by divine right, whereas William was named by Parliament as regnant rather than being, as had been Philip in the late 1550s, simply king by right of his wife. The New English Constitution. When William and Mary were officially crowned at Banqueting House, the same building where Charles I had met his end, they were also presented with a document known as the Declaration of Rights. In many ways, the Declaration was a descendant of earlier petitions to the Crown, such as the Petition of Right, 1628, and the Grand Remonstrance of 1642, a combination of complaints about James II and assertions of rights guaranteed by the ancient Constitution. Among the complaints against the former king were abuse of the suspending and dispensing power, prosecution even in the seven bishops, keeping a standing army during peacetime, violating the freedom of elections, arming and employing Catholics, and imposing sentences without due process of law. The Declaration, therefore, was mostly about redressing these grievances. The suspending and dispensing power could only be used with parliamentary consent. All taxes must be approved by Parliament. All subjects had the right to petition the king. A standing army could not exist in peacetime without parliamentary approval. Freedom of speech in Parliament was a fundamental right, and, quote, for the amending, strengthening, and preserving of the laws, parliaments ought to be held frequently, end quote. These, the Declaration attested, were the, quote, undoubted rights and liberties, end quote, of English subjects. As a result of the Declaration, which became the Bill of Rights later in the year, English parliaments have met annually since 1689 and have, as a result, achieved the style of a sovereign assembly that England's ruling classes had been seeking for a century. It is important, however, to note that although England was now a constitutional monarchy in which sovereignty was vested in king and parliament, it would be wrong to think of the monarch as a mere figurehead or as a puppet of parliament. The king still retained numerous royal prerogatives, including the right to declare war and peace, which William did prodigiously, call and dismiss parliament, veto legislation, appoint councillors and judges, create peers and knights, determine foreign affairs and trade, assemble and command the army, and many others. That the king was now constitutionally required to seek the advice or consent of Parliament in certain instances, and that he was now, quote, contracted, end quote, to rule in the best interests of the people, did not mean that he lacked sovereign authority. Another major step in the Revolution settlement was the production of a Toleration Act, which repealed most of the Clarendon Code and made nearly all forms of Protestant worship legal, while Anglicanism would still be the only national religion. Here again as was a compromise between Whigs, who preferred broad toleration of Protestants and the ability of churches to govern themselves, and Tories who preferred the supremacy of the Church of England. The act did not include toleration of Catholics, who would have to wait nearly another century and a half, to 1829, before they could worship openly, vote, and hold public office in England. The new constitution that came into existence in 1689 was based heavily on the work of John Locke, especially his letters concerning toleration, published in 1689, from 1689 to 1692, and two treatises of government, written circa 1678 to 80, published in 1690. In the first of the two treaties, Locke offered a rigorous refutation of Filmer's Patriarcha, which argued for the divine right of kings. In the second, Locke claimed that all people had a natural right to defend their, quote, life, health, liberty, and possessions from being, end quote, from being taken, even by the king. Although for the sake of living in civil society and the resolution of conflicts, man contracted with the king and legislators, their failure to live up to the terms of the contract could result in their removal and replacement. This, quote, social contract theory of government, end quote, went beyond Hobbes's argument in the Leviathan by allowing bad legislators to be replaced, if necessary, by revolution. Quote, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves in a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience, and are left to common refuge, which man hath provided for all men, against force and violence. Whensoever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption endeavor to grasp themselves, or put in the hands of any other absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty. End quote. Even in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution of 1688, Locke's ideas were fairly radical, but they did help to explain how the events that led to the placement of William and Mary on the throne could have been allowed to occur. Locke also argued for the separation of powers in government, particularly an executive embodied by the king and his council, and legislative branches embodied by Parliament and local assemblies, in order to provide checks and balances against the actions of each other for the public good. Locke's writings were extremely influential in the 18th century, when revolutions were exported to America, France, and throughout the Atlantic world. For this reason, Locke is considered one of the founding fathers of the European Enlightenment and the American Constitution. Although it occurred beyond the chronological scope of this book, one additional piece of legislation deserves to be mentioned, because it is considered to have completed the Revolution's settlement. This was the Act of Settlement of 1701, which determined the issue of succession to the crown in the event that Queen Anne dies childless. Between 1684 and 1700, Anne had been pregnant 17 times, with all but one pregnancy ending in miscarriage, a stillborn child, or a child who lived for a matter of months. In July 1700, her only living son, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, I don't know how you pronounce that, Gloucester, died, leaving Anne without an heir. Although Anne was only 36 years old, years of pregnancy and miscarriage had demonstrated that she was unlikely to produce another child. In theory, the closest in line to succession was her younger brother James Stuart, the warming pan baby, but the Bill of Rights had excluded all Catholics from the inheritance, which thereby passed over the majority of the Stuart line. The central purpose of the Act of Settlement was to name the closest Protestant by blood as heir to the throne, who at the time was Sophia, Electress of Hanover, granddaughter of James I, or her children. Ultimately, her son George I would claim the throne in 1714. The Act, which is still in effect in Britain, also contained several additional provisions that were designed to correct problems that had occurred during the 17th century. It required the monarch to, quote, join in communion with the Church of England, end quote. That is, to not only be Protestant, but also Anglican. It also forbade the monarch from leaving the dominions of England, Scotland, or Ireland, or from waging war against foreign countries in which England had no interest, without the consent of Parliament. These provisions were designed to ensure that foreign-born kings spent the majority of their time in Britain and did not use English armies to fight wars on behalf of other dominions. The Act also excluded any foreigner from sitting in the Privy Council or Parliament, or from holding high civilian or military office. This was so that foreign-born kings did not employ subjects from their other dominions, instead of English subjects, as had James I and William III. in order to prevent the type of undue royal influence on parliamentary affairs that had pervaded the reigns of the Stuarts. Another provision stated that crown office holders could not also sit in Parliament. To promote judicial independence and prevent royal manipulation of the legal bench, recall that Edward Coke was twice removed from his judgeship and that James II manipulated the bench to strengthen his suspending and dispensing powers. The act ensured that judges could only be removed by Parliament, and only if it could be proven they were not, quote, of good behavior, end quote. Finally, the act stated that the king could not issue a pardon to individuals who were under impeachment proceedings by Parliament. In sum, the Act of Settlement resolved issues that earlier documents, such as the Bill of Rights and Act of Toleration, had not addressed. By the end of the 17th century, therefore, England had emerged as a mixed constitutional monarchy. It was headed by the executive branch, the monarch, Privy Council, and high office holders, and dominated by an annual bicameral parliament, of which the House of Commons was considered the senior partner, and in which many members essentially became professional politicians who ascribed to a particular party ideology. These two branches of government, together with an independent judiciary, worked in concert to govern and legislate, but also had the ability to redress perceived abuses committed by the other branches. In addition, the Lockean contract theory of government allowed subjects to replace poor legislators, especially through the use of general elections, that at least in theory could improve the composition of Parliament and restore the social contract. Viewed from a modern mindset, of course, this system was hardly perfect. The franchise was still limited to land-owning men of a certain financial status, and members who sat in Parliament were unpaid and were therefore usually a great deal wealthier than their constituents, issues that would not be resolved for another 3 centuries. Nor was this yet the, quote, Westminster system, end quote, which included a first minister, cabinet, and governing and opposition parties. But it was the Revolution settlement that put mechanisms in place that allowed for these aspects of modern government to develop in the future. Question 7.4. Were there any abuses committed by the Stuart monarchs that the Restoration and Revolution settlement of Discussion question 7.4. Were there any abuses committed by the Stuart monarchs that the Restoration and Revolution settlement of 1689 to 701 failed to address? Why do you think this was the case? Voices of the Past, the Jesuits' Firing Plot. The following extract taps into two great fears among Londoners during the late Stuart period. First, as Francis Dolan has shown, many people believe that the Great Fire of London of 1666 had been deliberately set by Catholics, an event reminiscent of the failed Gunpowder Plot. Second, at the height of the, quote, popish plot, end quote, started by Titus Oates, Londoners feared that Jesuits were flooding into the country intent upon assassinating Charles II to make way for his Catholic brother James. The story of Elizabeth Owen, an accused arsonist of a home in central London, and a woman thought to be a Jesuit, was therefore a perfect tale for a pamphlet writer seeking to profit from these fears. Though Rome has been so often baffled in her weak and shallow contrivances, yet her agents think it not convenient to give over to the abhorrence and detestation of all sober and civil persons, nor can they prevail to work upon any but poor contemptible proselytes, converts, whom they, by the power of charms of gain, do bring into snares, so that their work may be perfected, though to their utter ruin, as may be observe in the many firing plots the cunning Jesuits have of late contrived, in which for the most part they employ silly servant maids, promising them after the pernicious work is done that they shall receive much wealth, which makes them go boldly on to perpetrate the horrid deed. But then, being taken by the hand of justice, they are left in great confusion and amazement, not knowing where to find the man that did enjoin them their destructive task. An instance of which may be plainly seen in a late unlucky mischief which happened to the house of Mr. Cooper, commonly known by the name of the Sussex House, near to Fetter Lane and in Fleet Street, the manner of which was as follows. About a month since, Mr. Cooper, having an occasion for a servant maid by reason of the departure of his former, was by a friend of his wished, recommended, to one Elizabeth Owen, who had of late dwelt in Gracechurch Street. And upon his friend's recommendation, he accordingly entertained her in his house in nature of his servant, she behaving herself seemingly well, and never was observed to have anyone follow her, except one young man, whom she called cousin, pretending he was her uncle's son. On Sunday last, being the 7th of November, her mistress and she had a small falling out about the dressing of a dinner, and some words passed, but in no likelihood of such force as to prompt her on to such a desperate revenge, the feud being reasonably pacified. About 9 o'clock in the evening she was observed to go upstairs, at which time she went into the garret, attic, opened several trunks in which were clothes which she took out and bundled up, putting several of her own amongst them. After that, with several candles, the tallow of which being found melted on the floor, she set the trunks on fire, placing them where she thought they soonest would take hold of the timber. This being done, and she seeing them to begin to blaze, went downstairs and placed herself in the bar, this being between 10 and 11 o'clock, when immediately the smoke came downstairs, of which before, any besides those of the house smelt it, she began to complain of, saying that there was an intolerable smoke which almost put her eyes out. Whereupon her mistress answered she saw no such mighty smoke as she pretended, but if there was any, she believed that it proceeded from the burning of faggots in the chamber overhead, there having been some gentlemen of her acquaintance lately in the same. But the wench persisted that it could not come from thence, but that the house, she feared, was on fire, or words to that effect. The smoke still increasing more and more, they were induced to believe some mischief indeed happened, or that some brand, ash, rolling out of the chimney might have taken hold of the hangings, so that running upstairs they went into the room where the fire had been made, but found all things in good order. When looking farther, they observed a smoke to come down the other pair of stairs that were yet higher, so that when they went up them, they found the garret all on fire, being fired in several places, and that in one place it had burnt quite through the floor into the chamber underneath. Whereupon they immediately called for help, which was not long ere before they had sufficient from their neighbors, and through Providence in a short time mastered that raging element, which then began to blaze through the roof of the house. And heaven knows, had it not been so stayed, stopped, it being amongst old buildings, what harm it might have done, or where have ended. After the fire was beaten down and the hurry was over, they began to search into the cause of it, or how it should happen, which they long had not done before they found, as we have already mentioned, several parcels of grease which come from the melted candles, and that the trunks being first opened were set on fire, which being light and dry had fired the rest.
Both the garrets being fired in several places, the trunks burnt to ashes, but the ashes of no woolen apparel found amongst the rest, which made them inquire what might become of the woolen that was in them. And upon further search they found that it was thrown out at the window into a little paved yard, and as it is before mentioned, many of Elizabeth Owen's own clothes packed up amongst them, which caused her master and mistress to suspect her as guilty of firing their house. And thereupon, by the advice of several neighbors, they caused her to be apprehended, and for that night secured. The next morning she was carried before the Right Worshipful Sir William Turner, alderman and justice of the peace for the city of London, who examined her strictly in all points, but could not get nothing out of her, she being of a sullen, dogged temper. Only she did declare to some persons of worth and credit that she did not design the fire should have begun so soon, but that it should have been much longer before it had kindled, so that it might have surprised her master and mistress, with all the rest of the family, herself only excepted, and have burnt them in their beds, so hard and desperate was her hellish design. After a long examination she was committed to Newgate, where she now remains. Not long after she was committed, her pretended cousin came to look for her, who perhaps had he been taken and narrowly sifted, examined, might have proved the Jesuit or the Jesuit's agent that employed her to act this desperate exploit and horrid villainy. Discussion question 7.5. What specific language does the pamphlet use to tap into late Stuart fears about fire and Catholics?